Part 2 on what the Bible says about homosexuality tonight in chapter 6. That's where we are. So basically where we left off is, if man wants to waddle and give over himself or herself over to their sins and lust, then God just simply says, okay, I'm going to let you do what you want to do so you can wallow in it. So that's basically what he does, essentially, right? So that's what we see here. So they wallow in their sins, or, because they choose not to listen. All right, so then your very punishment will be to do just that. All right, so for your sin will consume you, will overtake you. I mean, you won't think nothing else except for that very sin. That's how all sins work here. When it becomes the God of your life or vice of your life, it's what will destroy your life. Okay? If you allow it. That's what happens when it consumes you. All right, so the cycle of sin is quite vicious. And outside of grace and forgiveness is unrendering at that. So what was once an attraction becomes a degrading addiction. All right? That's why when people engage in sexual activity when they're not supposed to, or when older men have sex with younger girls, or girls have sex with older men. It's addictive. Sex is like that. It's an addiction. That's why you wait till you get married. So when you get to be a legal age, meaning 18 or older, you can do that with an older man if you're 18 or older, but you can't do that when you're underage. And a man should not be doing that either, because it's pedophilia and it's incest and it's wrong. Okay? So it's so important that it's sick. Why would you want to do that? There's plenty of girls out here that are over 18 and you can marry and do that with the normal way, the way God set it up to do it. But the way you're doing it is the wrong way. It's the wrong way to go about it. So, you want to go with people that are normally your age, okay? I mean, if you're 25 years apart, 30 years apart, as long as you're adults, that's fine. It doesn't matter what media says. It's what's in your heart. As long as you both are adult, consensual people when you got married, you can do what you want when you're married. As long as you both like what you're doing. Blessed, that is. By God, it's blessed and you both like it. And, and just that one sin. Also, I can mention other sins. Having affairs with other people's wives, taking other people's wives away from other people's husbands or wives going out with other people's husbands. That's sinful. That's sick. You're married, you're already in a relationship. Work it out. There's counseling. Get communication skills. Learn how to talk to each other. Communication is the key to all relationships, even if it's just a friendship. No communication equals no relationship. And that is true for marriage. That marriage will not last without communication. Okay? I don't care what anybody tells you. Whatever you read on the shelf, that's what they say in counseling and in the practice. Communication is the key to all things when it comes to relationships. Any relationship. Without it, that relationship does not exist. And the same is true for God. If you don't communicate with God, that relationship does not exist either. All right, let's go on. All right. So we know it becomes an addiction. It says both men and women are now all caught up in the very trap of sin, the sinful act, and have all been dishonored by their certitude to its very luring power of nature. And while the attributes that are described so far have now been existed primarily in the very minds, meaning suppression, and adultery, that's what it leads to. Man is a single unit. Okay? It says the very mind of man that dwells upon dishonorable thoughts and acts will result in a body that is dishonorable or dishonored in the very actions that they form from such a mind, from such of having that kind of mindset. I'm trying to get my words here. It says people who rebel against the Creator God eventually find their very selves freed to revel in their very rebellious nature. It says to their very demise. It says in verse 25, it reminds all of us here of what brings this kind of judgment that comes from God. Okay, I'll move this up here. All right. Now the theme of twisting and exchanging the truth for a lie has now been repeated. Okay, here. All right. So these people have exchanged what they possessed naturally that came from God, which was the real truth of God, in verse 20, for a lie. Or more literally, for the lie. This is really a deal they desperately really wanted. That's why they exchanged it, the truth for the lie. So for the truth of God, all right, tortures their conscience, their very conscience, and they will seek any kind or any form of remedy to silence its very voice. You know, like they might drink to try to suppress it, or they might take drugs, or they might do something else to try to ignore it, another sin to, to try to push it out. But that doesn't work. Trust me, it doesn't work. So that's why a lot of times they do that. Okay, trying to see where we're at. All right. Since though man was not made to tell or to embrace untruth, says in this very rebellion, he or she sets his or her affections upon what is unnatural, meaning a lie. And while he or she knows that it is really a lie, he or she prefers to lie rather than to tell the truth or to realize the truth. All right? And that brings conviction of his or her very rebellion and sin. Now, he works to convince himself, or she works to convince herself, and she or he knows or loves this very lie so much. And in time, he or she is successful by hiding that lie. All right? That's what we see happening here. At least they think they're successful, but really what they've done is turned their back on God, and they've really been dishonored and been outcast by God, so to speak, because of their very rebellion. All right, so let's go on here. The worship and service of man's very soul, that insuitable or insistible religious rebellion of nature, of that very creature made in God's very image, cannot avoid the very twisting that sin often brings along with it. It says, as we have already noted earlier, men will worship, but when he or she is actively involved in suppressing the very living truth of God, that worship will be focused anywhere but on or upon the true and living God. It'll be focused on something else. You see, because they exchanged God for an idol. So that will be put on that instead of God, where it's supposed to be on God. So that which has been created worships often serves that which is likewise created by that person, that image. Okay, so in the effort to avoid recognizing the very blessed creature, says the twistedness becomes quite blunt and increasingly reprehensible. So it's just quite there obvious, basically. Look at verse 26 in Romans chapter 1. It says, for this reason God gave them over to their sin regarding their very passions and lusts. For their women were exchanged the very natural functionality of a relationship, for a man, for that which is what? Unnatural, meaning having lesbian or gay or bestiality relationships or incestual relationships with children. And all this falls under the realm of unnatural or inappropriate relationships. Okay, just to make it clear. Verse 27 says, in the same very way also, men also abandoned their natural orientation of having sex with women, the normal way, and the functionality of it, into, and they burned in their hearts to have desires to be with each other, to have gay relationships, like that of woman, the counterpart, and have bestiality relationships or relationships with children, ancestral or pedophilia or, weird relationships, which are not natural. All right, so men were committing also, indecent acts, and they were receiving, both men and women were receiving in their own persons the due penalty of their error, which is death. Okay, that's the due penalty. That's what's described there, what Paul says. It says, these verses form a single sentence. Okay, and it's connected directly to the preceding words. It says, for this reason, Paul does not depart or change his subject, when it comes to his theme here at this point in time. He keeps it there. It says these verses are not separated. They're not separated. No, they are a contextual leap into another subject. Says the theme continues on without any break. Okay? Says, but here, this is where Paul teaches us that because of idolatry happening here, of mankind, God gives men over to their degrading very passions and lust. And the New American Standard Version, it says that. In the NIV, it says shameful lust. And bile passions, that comes from the New King James. It says, however, the phrase is translated, it obviously refers to desires and passions that are dishonorable, and it's also indicative of what God's very judgment will fall upon all those who indulge in the selfish, lustful behaviors. Okay, so I'm just going to say all sin here, not just homosexuality, but every kind of sin. This is the same result what will have to fall on anyone who continues to trade the truth for the lie. All right. So then Paul goes on and gives us a fitting example of these degrading passions, and he goes ahead and illustrates this for us. That illustrates the very twistedness by this is what he's going to do here. It says, at the very core of all human identity. This is where Paul first mentions lesbianism. And why do you think that is? Because homosexuality is another form of lesbianism. It's just the male part. But female part is also lesbianism. Okay? Now, this is describing clearly to us adult natural, or not natural, but mutual lesbian activity. It says this has also been seen in the description that is given in both verses 26 and 27. For verse 27 begins with and the same way. It says also indicates that the description of male homosexual activity in that verse is parallel to the lesbian activity in verse 26. Also, or hence, the very description of lesbianism is a sin and crime against nature in verse 26 would also apply to male and female homosexuality as well. It says, in the description of of mutually and indecent acts in verse 27 would apply to lesbian activity as well, not just homosexuality or just gay, but gay applies to both sexes. All right, so there is a note of really sadness here in Paul's very words here. But for even there, women, okay, evade. It says naved. That's the New King James, or the female as a result of the twistedness of their sins exchanges the very natural sexual functionality or orientation. Says the most basic meaning here of the words that Paul uses here. Says for that which is against nature. Says this is a voluntary act. Says these women exchange the natural order and function for that which is against nature. Says there is a choice that's involved here. Okay? Says a choice that expresses the very twistedness of the rebellion that is against the Creator that Paul is illustrating here. Says the natural sexual passions or function is still known to these women, but they have chosen to exchange it for something that is unnatural by doing it with each other instead of with a man. Okay? Now Paul uses the very same term here where he had used it in the previous verse, in verse 26. Exchanging the truth of the living God for the lie. So obvious to us. Obviously, this exchange carries along with it the same negative characteristics and behavior, connotations. It says the exchange of God's truth for a lie is the very same in exchanging the natural way of sexual use, that's supposed to be, for the unnatural ways of sexual orientation. It says the choice is I think it's purposeful in the first, and it is in the second as well. Verse is what it's saying. Verse 26 to 27. That's what we're referring to here. Now the meaning against nature, what is that? Well, it is defined by the very context here. It's the word that's been translated, means sexual function. It is not ambiguous or questionable here. It's very clear what it means here. It says, the conjunction of the word for natural is likewise clear. And the resulting phrase is natural sexual function is easily understood here by both Paul's original audience back then and also by any unbiased person today who reads that same verse. He is also referring to the way that God created human beings. The way in the natural order, male and female, both male and female, and in their sexual union that comes between each other, in intimacy and time of marriage. That's when that happens. That takes place between a man and a woman. It says this is what has been exchanged for, to having sex with one another, same sex, which is wrong. It's wrong. Don't do that, kids. Don't do that, people. If you're doing it, stop it. Because that's not the natural order of things. When you have sex with the same person, the same sex, you're supposed to be attracted to the opposite sex. So when you're having sex, you need to make sure you're with the opposite sex. You need to make sure you're married first. Okay? Because even if you're having sex and you're doing it with the opposite sex, there's still consequences. There's diseases, there's AIDS, there's premature pregnancy. These are things you got to think about, teenagers. And then there's guilt, and there's, all the things that happen, and, it can cause a lot of unnecessary trouble. That's why it's good to wait till you get older and when you get married. And that way you can have all those sexual things with the person that you're supposed to be with, the opposite sex, not the same sex, opposite sex, and you're doing it in the right orientation and in the right form. And that way you don't have to worry about it if it's sinful, because you're in the eyes of God, and God won't say it's sinful when you're married. It's not sinful when you're married. Okay? Now, and the downward spiral of sinfulness is the result of what happens here. God created women with a natural sexual functionality of orientation, like we were talking about. It says when one rebels against God's very truth and then exchanges that truth for a lie, that lie then impacts everything else in one's life, or I would say in man or a woman's life, meaning the natural very function has been exchanged for that which is against nature. And it's unnatural, right? That is it's unnatural. It's also against the created order of things, okay? That's really what it's talking about there, folks. It's against the creative order of things, the way God set this thing up in the very beginning. In the Garden of Eden, we're supposed to go after a man if you're a woman, and if you're a woman, you go after a man. When you're a man, you go after a pretty lady. You don't go after another man, or you don't go after another woman if you're a woman. You go after the opposite sex. That's why in tic-tac-toe there's X's and O's, because they're opposite. They're different. And that's the way it is with us. That's the way it's supposed to be. Verse 27 of Romans 1 is a continuation of that same thought, where it begins in the same very way, by tying the two verses together without any question or doubt. Verse 22 speaks of women, or the women. In verse 27, it begins with the men. It says the men have abandoned or have left the natural use of women. And Paul uses the same wording here as he used when he uses lesbianism. He uses the same concept. It says these men have abandoned. Another word signifying choice would be the natural sex or natural use of the women. All right, natural relations basically is NIV. God's intention in the sexual expression of His very creatures to be between a man and a woman, like we said earlier, just as it was with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. All right, this is the natural order of sexual functionality. Okay, but these men have abandoned this very natural way of things for an unnatural way. All right, they know what it really is, but they rejected it, and they have left it altogether. So that's what homosexuality does. All right, that's the core function of it. Now, Paul's description of homosexuality is quite clear too, and without any compromise here. There's no compromise to it. There's no wording. You hear people say that. It says they burned in their own very lust and desires towards one another, meaning the same sex. That's the New American Standards wording of it. It says is rendered by which is the NIV, and were inflamed with lust for one another. Both terms speak clearly of sexual lust and desires. It says these desires, very desires, are consuming them. Okay, such would point us towards an ongoing lifestyle, not a single incident here. Okay, this is a continuation that's going on with many people of sexual debauchery. It says, and these desires are mutual. Okay, it says the desire goes both ways here. Okay, one homosexual man desiring another man, and vice versa. Woman is desiring another woman in that way. Says this point is important here to remember. There's one important point to reference here, is to the twisting attempts to blunt the force of this passage. Like they don't want to admit that they're doing these things, so they'll try to deny it and say, "Oh, that's not what it says. This is irrelevant, man. It's not true. You're lying. This is not true. No, we're allowed to do this. The Bible, we're allowed to do this. Don't say that." All right, but it does. All right, so the mutuality of this desire has now been emphasized by this phrase. Paul says, "Men with men." All right, the Apostle Paul leaves no doubt as to what this reference really means here, okay? When he says adult homosexuals, that's both men and women, says these are active men or active women. They act upon their very lust and desires by accomplishing what Paul identifies for us as literally the shameful deed, or as it is rendered by the NSV, meaning New American Standard Version, and the NIV, both say this: indecent acts. All right, the term comes from an Old Testament word that referred to something as deformed, okay, or hence flows into the concept of perversion, and then devasion. All right. Now that is part and parcel of this section of this chapter, all right, in Romans. All right, this is no possible way that of reading this term as just as referring to anything natural here at all, or simply unusual or out of norm here. No. Now, Paul views homosexual activity as shameful and indecent, or indecent acts. Says the fact is, I am on the air right now. I'm on the air. You'll have to call back later. Okay. Shameful and it's indecent act. All right. Now, this fact is further proven here by what? The final phrase of verse 27, where Paul writes, says, "And receive in their own very passions the due penalty of their very error. Men cannot expect to engage in deviant activity without receiving their due penalty, which is death." It says, while interpreters will often differ over the very extent and very meaning of what that penalty is, or what the penalty is of, but the Bible's quite clear about it and how that penalty is to be received. All right, it says in their own very persons. It says a number of facts are beyond question here. It says first of all, the fact that a penalty or a punishment is attached to that era of performing these very shameful types of deeds reinforces the understanding that these are sinful deeds that are worthy of retribution, meaning punishment. Secondly, this is a due, all right, that's given. It's given, or necessarily punishment. And it is fitting that such deeds receive a penalty, or penalty. Says God's justice demands here that the twisting of his created order receive a punitive response. Okay, thirdly, their error, let's talk about that, is not mainly just a miscalculation here, or just something that happened by chance, as we might, use the term here, error. No, today, indeed, a better rendering of this terminology, or term, okay, which is used in the New Testament, it refers to being mislabeled, or wait a minute, misled, or drawn from or away from the right path, is perversion, meaning they've been drawn away. So just as the what is that? The NIV renders it. I'm not used to it being like there should be a space between there, but that's okay. Anyway, it's got NIV render, but it's supposed to be 2 words. But anyway, puts it the due penalty for their perversion, for their very perversion, we know is death, because Paul told us that earlier. That's the penalty of all sin, like we started off with. Now, again, options may differ as to what receiving, what is receiving that penalty that is due to by doing their error. It says in their own persons. And that means some believe along the very lines with what John Chrysostom had said. It says one of the leading commentators of the early Christian church says that the penalty referred to sin that's found in this very passage is the sexual perversion itself. Of course, that's not what Paul said, but that's what he said. All right? So it becomes a cycle, okay? And the sin itself is degrading at that. And the sinner who is trapped by his or her own lustfulness or behaviors says while others believe that this is to refer their final punishment, that they will receive, which they will receive in their own persons, with their own time. Meaning the penalty is due to their blunt violations of God's will, of course, okay, with the spread of AIDS, and which is academic. I gotta stop this. So I'm getting
15 seconds. 2 seconds over.
Enough. All right. AIDS is an epidemic disease at that. It says many have attempted to connect this passage with the disease AIDS itself. However, this AIDS disease also impacts non-homosexuals as well, offenders who have sex, outside of marriage or with other partners that may have it. So that's not just for homosexual people, so that's totally taken out of context. And not every homosexual offender receives this very punishment either.